So the first aspect of Hal's long career is as practitioner and working with Hal. So we're very pleased that we have the whole of the home team here today and a client, Jennifer Adams, who was their client for the Inner London Royal Parks Commission. So from nearest to me is Claire Page, Mark Darwent, I think you know Hal, Chris Carter, Jennifer, and Martin Bartier, who runs the London office. So over to you.
Thank you very much.
To start.
Okay.
You ready?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I should say, can you not hear me? But good morning. The photos behind me, incidentally, which are rolling along, show our offices at Filkins at various stages from the very beginning to last week, I think. I'm not going to talk to them at all, they're just background, really. I've been allocated 10 minutes to cover the 53 years that I've been associated with Hal, which works out at 11.3 seconds per year, so let's keep it running. I'd never met Hal until the question of my joining Colvin and Moggridge arose, and that arose because I'd worked for Brenda Colvin in summer holidays between 1965 and 1967, and she'd evidently noted down my knowledge of plants and horticultural expertise, such as both of them are, for future use perhaps. And a chance correspondence with her 2 years or so later included the message, "Let me know if you want to change." I'd gone off to work for Cornwall County Council for 4 years or so, and in that time I'd acquired my wife, Stephanie, who's out there in the audience. There she is. So in 1972, I took her up on the offer, and I hadn't met Hal until then. I remember meeting him in her sitting room slightly apprehensively, because I did wonder whether Hal might be a little bit resentful of having me dropped on him by Brenda Colvin. If he ever did, he never showed it, and he could presumably have vetoed it anyways. We were also looking, Stephanie and I, for a post in which she could have some involvement too, because she is also a landscape architect. We met as students, and Truro didn't offer many opportunities for that. We got on from that moment onwards very well indeed, I would say. I don't think we ever looked back. And I loved being back in a proper design studio, because the County Council's planning department was a well-meaning and earnest affair, but not very inspiring. And the first thing that struck me about Hal was his incredible capacity for work. As well as having, by that stage, Colvin and Moggridge was about 3 years old, taken on most of Brenda Colvin's jobs, including all the big ones. She was still working, but the burden of the office was carried by Hal. At the same time, he was the honorary secretary of the Institute of Landscape Architects, as it then was, and he became president, as we've heard, in 1979 to 81, and then the representative on IFLA, the International Federation of Landscape Architects. And I think both Mark and Martin will also testify to this extraordinary level of output, how it left us standing and sort of wondering how it's done. But we very quickly grew to trust each other in all matters, although partnership wasn't discussed until a bit later. I was appointed as an associate in 1974 and became a partner after Brenda Colvin's death, which had been agreed some time before. How we worked together, and I'll talk a bit about that. In truth, we didn't work together a great deal. We worked on the big projects, reservoirs and nuclear power stations and so on. And broadly speaking, Hal was always the person who appeared at the public inquiry, and I, broadly speaking, was the person who churned out drawings and reports and things like that. Well, not only I, but other people as well, of course. It wasn't a fixed way of working at all, but that's roughly how it panned out. And aside from that, we each ran on parallel tracks, obviously talking to each other as we went along, doing our own jobs. I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Hal?
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
I had full responsibility for the Filkins office when Hal went off to Sheffield to take up the role of Professor of Landscape Architecture. And for 2 years, between 1964 and 1984 and 86, I got to the stage where I muddle decades all the time, even centuries. Not quite that yet. And then delighted when Hal came back to Filkins, because I'd been pretty busy during that time. Our management style, well, it was very relaxed, really. We were a smallish firm, only 2 partners. Meetings tended to be on the ad hoc side. You know, we need to have a talk about this. Can we make 20 minutes this afternoon? We did occasionally have formal meetings, but there had to be some things. If a new member of staff was needed, we had a constant run of relatively even flow of applicants for work with us. And we had a very broad range of projects which proved very useful in times of recession, because, for example, when Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1979, big public works tended to go down, and correspondingly large corporate works and private works, for that matter, went up. So we were poised in a good position to maintain a good cash flow and keep going through good times and bad. I'll just talk a bit about my overall recollections of Hal. Well, I say recollections, they're fortunately ongoing. But above all, this intense commitment to everything he does. He's an ardent supporter of causes, as you all know. He's busy at the moment, I think, still with the Holocaust memorial thing in the Victoria Gardens by the Houses of Parliament. As I say, letters to the Times seem to be quite frequent. Do you still write to them as frequently? Or?
Not so often.
No, that's my impression. But I might relate a couple of small anecdotes which show up his gently unself-conscious person. There's no pomp or ceremony about Hal at all, as these little anecdotes will relate. The first one was his famous duffel coat. In my memory, his famous mud-caked duffel coat. And in my memory, which I'm certain of, is that it was tied around the waist with a piece of binder twine. And he would wear this to meetings great and small. Did you actually wear it to the Duke of Marlborough at Blenheim? I suspect you did, but...
I think so.
Yes, I would imagine so. I think that sort of summed him up. And I must also relate an anecdote from work we did in Libya between 1977, well, mostly in 1977. We got a job of sorts in Benghazi, and the day we were due to fly out, Gaddafi declared war on Egypt and sacked all the Egyptian clerks and everybody who made the place work. So that we only got about 3 days in Benghazi, and were then told we had to get back to Tripoli if we were ever to get a flight home. And I had been mostly building a dossier of plants that we could use, and Hal was noting down all sorts of other details that we would need to be able to work in the general atmosphere of the place. And when we were back in Tripoli, we tried to carry on this work, although we were in a different city. The difficulty was we had no papers telling anybody else that we had the right to be there. I had been arrested 3 times in Benghazi by citizens' arrests with no great consequence. And on one of these occasions, we were out in the suburbs somewhere, which was said to be safe. And I was peering at plants somewhere, and I turned around to find Hal lying in the gutter, making notes of a car number plate. And I said, "What are you doing, Hal?" And he said he was trying to improve his knowledge of Arabic numbers, which are very beautiful, actually. I mean, the sort of posh ones, as though painted with a brush. You know, they have lovely flowing shapes. So it was just like Hal to want to know that. But from a car number plate, I wasn't so sure. In a dictatorship and a police state where we had no papers relating to where we were at all. And Hal sort of said, oh, don't be so stuffy, and all words to that effect. And of course, nothing happened, so he was right, which exactly sums up our relationship, I think.
It was rather important. I had to rescue from prison quite a lot of times.
Only 3 in 3 days. Anyway, thank you very much, Hal, for everything. And in particular, can I thank you for the dedication of your book, Slow Growth, to me and to all the other staff through the years of Colvin and Moggridge. I was very touched by that because I didn't feel I deserved it, really, but thank you very much. I couldn't have worked for anyone better. Thank you.
With.
Thank you. Mark?
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Darwent. I'm a current director of Colvin and Moggridge and a very long-standing employee of the company. After finishing my studies in Manchester, I had an interview with Chris in Filkins in 1984, and I was offered a place at their newly opened Sheffield office, where Hal had just begun his professorship at the University of Sheffield. Our office was in the ground floor of Hal's home at number 7 Gladstone Road, in a lovely leafy part of Sheffield. It was a large Victorian house with lots of space, and we had a pianola for lunchtime entertainment. And I fondly remember pedalling like fury to play the Sheik of Araby, which you must have got fed up with, Cass. Working at Hal's home, I got to know his wife, Cass, and his family well. And I often played snooker with his youngest son, Lawrence, after work. Lawrence is here. Fresh from studies, I remember discovering quite quickly that I knew very little of use. And work was difficult at first, as Hal was often in the university. But Hal was very tolerant of my ignorance and left clear notes, instructions, and diagrams, and was very patient in explaining what was needed of me and in correcting my inevitable errors. With his mentoring, I eventually started to become useful, and I began to get more involved in some of the interesting projects that we had on at the time. And I hope you might be interested in the following images of a couple of Hal's major projects that I had a role in and that proved to be great opportunities for me to learn from him.
Yes.
One of the first projects I worked on in Sheffield was the new underground operations centre for the RAF near High Wycombe. This was a huge underground facility producing lots of surplus spoil, which required extensive earth modelling. It was a particularly interesting and sensitive project, as we were commissioned by the Property Services Agency to work on a project for the RAF on agricultural fields owned by the National Trust and surrounded by National Trust woodland. Now, I was far too junior to be involved in the briefing, but I believe, Hal, that our role was to design a minimalistic, naturalistic agricultural landscape that retained all the spoil excavated from the huge underground building on site. This was then used to recontour the land to hide the RAF facility from a new National Trust track, which was to run along the side of the site here, and also from a minor road to the north. The plan's the wrong way up, but first error. But the road runs down this side, so the view's across this field. The image behind me shows a model of the proposal prepared for the National Trust to show to their members. The concrete cap of the building was covered with earth, forming a central mound, and Hal designed a subtle incline in the fields to the north, ending in a new field hedge along a ridge here. This had a similar effect to a large ha-ha, hiding the security fencing, building entrances, and all the site traffic from view from a local lane. Now, the model periscope photos on this image, sort of cutting-edge technology in 1984, sort of precursor to walkthroughs, CAD walkthroughs nowadays, show this effect. And you can see in the bottom of those images there, the view across the fields with a hedge line on the ridge, and then the underground building beyond that. Ground levels were also raised all along the western side of the site, with a steep slope up from the National Trust footpath. The sections that I drew up show how Hal manipulated the levels so that the building entrances and active areas were immediately hidden from the path by the new landform. In some places, the bank was so steep that we couldn't topsoil, and we had to plant successfully into bare chalk. Subsequent native shrub planting into the steep chalk bank was designed to eventually hide the security fencing from view from the path. Throughout this project, Hal was very good at delegating work to me. He encouraged me to take responsibility for minor aspects of the project. I attended all site meetings with him, taking notes and writing them up afterwards. Hal would then make any corrections before they were issued. And this, site inspections, and the journeys to and from the site together, where I could ask any number of probably stupid questions to him, as he was a captive audience, were a great way to understand the workings of a project. For me, Newark was a really good introduction to contractors, site works, levels, ground modelling, and working with soils. Hal is really good at identifying and conveying important aspects of a project with very succinct site notes, diagrams, and sections, which, whilst they might look very sketchy, are always very accurately drawn. For all that, looking back now 40 years on, my abiding memory of Newark is one of mud and sticky white chalk. But Hal's artful manipulation of the site levels are a great success. The underground centre is inconspicuous, and the National Trust land retains its natural beauty. To quote from Hal's Slow Growth, "The artist's hand and eye must be invisible." I show this project because it's a relatively incidental project. Anyone walking along the track or being in the area locally who might know of this underground centre wouldn't appreciate the amount of work that went into and the thought that went into the design of the site to make it so inconspicuous. And that's typical of Hal. It doesn't really matter what the project is. There's a great deal of thought always goes into his work. I visited the site again this summer, Hal, and I can report that the National Trust track is extremely well used by walkers and runners. All of them are completely unaware of the RAF complex, situated only a couple of metres away, as you can see from these photos of the track. After 2 years in Sheffield, I moved down to the Filkins office, mostly still working with Hal, but also with Chris Carter and David McQuitty. The 1990s were a very busy period in the office, with the Central London Royal Parks Commission, significant work at Jersey Zoo, and an appointment to provide landscape advice at Castletown Cox House in Ireland. This was to prove a major project for Hal and me, lasting for 12 years. Castletown House started as a project for us in 1992. By then, I had somehow become an associate of the practice, running smaller projects myself and managing larger projects under Hal or Chris's direction. As you can see on the photos, Castletown Cox is a fabulous Palladian mansion in County Kilkenny in Ireland. It sat in a 500-acre domain of arable fields and pasture. Our clients set about restoring the house and gardens and employed Hal to create a parkland setting to take full advantage of the capability of the landscape to the south of the house. These images show the house at the start of the project, with extensive tree cover in the gardens and an avenue of lime trees. See on that one there? That lined the east drive, bisecting the landscape to that side of the house. Our client was very bold in deciding to remove most of the trees in the garden to the south of the house, wanting to open up the wonderful distant views to the Comra Mountains. There was limited environmental protection in Ireland at this time, and I'm sure that such a bold intervention would be much more difficult to achieve nowadays. But it was definitely the right move. The southerly views from the house, which you'll see later, are glorious. Hal led the early phases of the project, which included the reconstruction of the garden with all the paths and steps restored, and the construction of a long Brownian ha-ha along the entire south garden boundary. You can see the ha-ha under construction. I promise you there wasn't a wiggle in it, that's just my poor photo stitching. But it was a beautiful piece of work. We had a very good Irish contractor to do the work for us, who was incredibly skilled at virtually everything he did. Here again, Hal's expertise with levels was evident, as low parkland levels to the east of the gardens were built up completely to hide the ha-ha from the parkland side. And this can be seen in one of the images. This image to the bottom here, on the western side, on the eastern side, the levels were quite high, but on this side we had to build the levels up substantially. These images follow on. These images show the magical effect that Hal achieved through this careful attention to detail with levels. The boundary between the garden and park is blurred, with the parkland sweeping right up to the formal garden hedge. If you look carefully, particularly at this bottom slide, you can just see a change in the tone of the grass where the ground was built up. Slightly paler in colour. Other works following on from the garden and ha-ha included the construction of a large oval reflecting pool on the house axis, the restoration of the original lake and canal, the creation of a woodland garden behind the house, and the repaving of the north courtyard, which you can see on this photo. Hal and I then began on the creation of a new 500-acre park on farmland to the south of the house, to provide a setting appropriate to the wonderful architecture. This can be seen in part in the aerial photograph, which was taken soon after completion of the project. See the ha-ha that wraps around the gardens that were restored, a lot with the help of Mrs. McGann and Lady Salisbury, and the parkland setting out from the house on the south side. Now, I remember several very, very long days at Castletown, walking every part of the landscape with Hal to try and determine the best route for a new main drive across the South Park, and to explore and map all significant views to and from the house. The drive particularly had several iterations before the final layout was agreed. Hal's experience of restoring historic landscapes led us to a sort of reverse process, where mapping key views that we wanted to make as view cones on a plan left us with gaps where trees could be planted to eventually frame these views. And these plans behind me show a series of studies that we did of views from different parts of the estate that were then combined on this plan to leave these gaps, which is where all the tree planting occurred. This tree planting was fully implemented over a series of seasons. The final master plan shows the completed park with a new drive connecting the original Beach Avenue in the west to the existing east drive for the final approach to the house. Drive sweeps round, across the landscape and back up to the house. We explored several options for a lake in the South Park, but with a very limited water supply, Hal conceived a meandering river which the drive crosses on two bridges. This works very well with beautiful views to the house across the water on the new drive. Now, Hal, I recently contacted Sean Drowan, who we worked with, who was the head gardener at Castletown, who's still working there. And he took these photographs this summer, which show how the parkland and the tree planting has developed. and how some of the views from the drive have become properly framed by the trees that we moved. I think the photos speak for themselves. The two big trees you see out there are the only two, one's a Luckham oak, were the only two trees in the park that we were able to retain. Everything else was newly planted. It's really pleasing to see that all the young lime trees that we repositioned from the east at Drive Avenue, using a large tree spade brought over from Gloucester, have thrived. And these are groups of them off the side of the drive, framing a view to the cupola. Castletown was a wonderful project for me, and I've learned so much just from working with you, Hal. I was always struck by the rigour you applied to landscape assessment on our site visits together, developing a deep understanding of the project and the opportunities that it presented, and then making accurate notes that could be relied on by others back in the office. These experiences of working with you have had a profound influence on how I function as a landscape architect, particularly in how I see and assess the landscape. And this rigour and devotion to getting it right on site can be seen in this image. At least, Hal, I think that's what you were doing. Yeah, may have been, yeah. So I'd like to finish, Hal, with what I'm sure will be the overriding theme of the day, and that is to say, thank you, Hal. Thank you for being such a generous employer, mentor, and colleague for the entirety of my professional career. And with that, I'll hand over to my co-director, Martin Bartier, who will talk about his experiences of working with Hal.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'm the new kid on the block. I've only worked with Hal and Chris since 1992. First in Filkins and then in London since 1997. My first large project with Hal was the Wallingford Arts Park Gallery on the Thames floodplain in 1993. I just finished my master's thesis on floodable landscapes with Tom Turner. And he generously invited me to join the client meeting, I think the first client meeting, briefing about the site. Rather than think of flooding as a constraint, we embraced the characteristics of the site and proposed more frequent flooding. The proposed galleries would be on stilts, and by sculpting the land, we could increase the capacity of the floodplain and create more frequent flood events, ephemeral dynamic sculptures in their own right. Although never built, we did secure a no objection from the Environment Agency. Given that we were proposing development on the floodplain, that was the key technical constraints we had to overcome. I remember arriving on site early one morning, or at least I thought it was early, but you emerged from behind a hedgerow and with copious notes, and you'd clearly been there for a long time already. It was an early lesson in your rigorous approach and understanding of a place before beginning a design that I've tried to carry with me. In 1992, we were appointed on the first of what was to become 3 consecutive term commissions with the Inner Royal Parks, which consist of St James's Park, Regent's Park, Green Park, Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens. In fact, with the subsequent view studies, we worked with the Royal Parks over a period of some 20 years. Jennifer Adams was instrumental in commissioning Hal's reports and steering projects to make his ideas happen on the ground. I'm delighted Jennifer has agreed to join us today and share recollections of working with Hal from a client perspective. Jennifer, what are your recollections of your first meetings with Hal and first impressions, please?
Yes, I've been running the Inner Royal Parks for some years when the government decided to form Royal Parks Agency. So for 2 years, I've been overseeing the transition to an agency which commenced in April '92, and the commission for Colvin and Moggridge came into force at the same time, and I returned to my original job of running the inner parks at the same time as Hal took up the commission. And we spent a lot of time discussing the parks, their status as historic Grade 1 landscapes, their importance as part of our national heritage, the pressures they're under, the good things about them, the bad things about them. And in the course of all this discussion, I think Helen and I realised we both had a mutual passion for urban green space and its good management and design. And it led to a very happy collaboration. So I wanted to come today to thank Hal for a very enjoyable period of work.
And I would thank in return to have a lovely client.
So I've recognised from the talk so far from his colleagues that the traits I was observing in Hal were there for them as well. He had a unique way of looking at the landscape and visualising it in 3 dimensions, and both, well, 4 I suppose, time, history and all of that, but also the lie of the land. He could see through things that were obscuring and spoiling the design, and he did an awful lot of work to understand it all. So we had a very thorough briefing on things, and then we progressed from there to commissioning various works. I think the thing that I would say is that Hal did an awful lot of work. He was able to visualise things in ways people couldn't, and then he was very committed to making things happen. And I thoroughly enjoyed working with him.
Thank you. Much of our work in the parks was rather subtle, but one project with a significant impact was the Lido in Hyde Park. The project stemmed from Hal's 1993 review of buildings around the Serpentine, a landscape-led review with architects being appointed only once a concept that put the park landscape first had been established. The problem Hal was asked to address at the Lido was that much of the south shore of the Serpentine was closed to the public, enclosed by tall fencing for the swimming club and fee-paying members of the public to swim. Hal's response was to propose a sunbathing area away from the Lido Lake, here, carefully screened and closed for the swimming club as well as the paying public, with a bridge giving access to much reduced shoreline beach. The majority of the south shoreline was thus reopened, with the public being diverted for just a short length around the beach, with a bridge link underneath the bridge link to emerge at the Lido. It's an example of your public spirited approach to landscape design, Hal. Access to the pavilion year-round made it a more attractive proposition as a cafe, while also bringing prominent building back into year-round use, with care and maintenance that brings. Jennifer, if I can bring you back in, you briefed Hal on the Lido. What are your recollections of the project and the context?
Like many of the things in Royal Parks, there were lots of things that were contentious and difficult. And the difficulty with the swimming was that I think the public swimming, I think must have started in the 30s. And it was something that happened, I think, from June to September, something like that. The water was untreated, and it was very deep in places. There's a bomb crater in the Serpentine, which is about 18 feet deep. So it wasn't a conventional place you could easily manage things. The attitude to health and safety had been very lax in the past. So we used to have to worry about all sorts of aspects of this public swimming. In addition, we had a very dedicated swimming club who had swum every morning, early morning swim throughout the year with no supervision and under their own risk, I suppose you could put it. And changing anything like this had been going on, in the case of the swimming club, since 1865, I think, was always going to be difficult. So we approached it with some trepidation. But of course, Hal, as usual, did all his homework and came up with a very successful way of separating the swimming but allowing the public back access to the lake. It brought the whole of the South Shore back to life because it had been very bleak before that. We were able to put some planting in along the edge, which softened the edge and gave the wildfowl somewhere to retreat from the people. And the swimming club were happy, and everyone was happy, and it was all very good.
Thank you. The next project I've chosen to highlight is Horse Guards Parade, which is another hugely impactful project. It was used as a car park for civil servants, and Hal presented a short paper making a compelling case to remove the cars and restore the parade ground and its historic relationship with the inner park. As a Fine Arts Commission at the time, he persuaded the Commission to give up the privilege of being allowed to park on the parade ground in order that they may set an example for others to follow. It was an early example of a London civic space being recovered from the car and restored for pedestrian, public, ceremonial and touristic benefit. It was also an example of you going above and beyond your course, a cause you believed in, Hal. A key element of the Horse Guards proposals was to restore the visual link between the parade ground and the inner park, as it had been historically, as captured in this 1857 engraving. Nash's layout for the inner park appears to flow past the island to meet the parade ground with an obvious close visual connection between them. Reopening the view required the removal of 2 plane trees from the avenue along Horse Guards Road. The road was built as a temporary wartime measure that cut off the parade ground from the park. The road was retained, as many temporary wartime measures were. It then attracted a tree line, which, while no doubt well intended, further reinforced the visual separation of Horse Guards from the inner park. A Saturday morning dawn raid by a tree surgeon restored the visual connection. This leads us nicely onto a large body of work I've done with Hal, which is view studies. In particular, Hal, your Sky Space report from 2001, which sought to protect the inner parks from intrusion by tall buildings. Jenny, again, you commissioned the study. Could you explain what brought it about?
Yes, in the 1990s, we started to have a problem with tall buildings going up further away from the park than we'd ever had to think about before. And up until then, there'd been a planning policy within the City of Westminster that any buildings that went up had to be no taller than the height of the plane trees around the perimeter, so they didn't impinge on the views, because what people told us they liked about the road parks was the fact they could get away from the city, and when they were in the parks, they could just see greenery and trees and nature. And it was in danger of being eroded. And so I was very concerned about how we could deal with this, because we didn't have the tools to work out which planning applications were coming that we should be worried about and doing something about, and which ones we could ignore. So I asked Hal if he could look at this and see if he could come up with a way of us addressing or responding to this pressure that would protect the views that were important within the parks. And as you've heard from what's been said earlier about the work you were doing earlier, Hal was extremely good at this. I had no idea what he was going to do or how he was going to do it. But when he produced his report, I was absolutely astonished, because it was such a groundbreaking piece of work, and it gave us all the armour we needed to try to address the various pressures that were on the horizon. And then I think, Martin, when you go on to talk about this, what will become apparent is that this was a transferable skill that was recognised widely, way beyond the Royal Parks. So over to you.
Thank you. I was fascinated by this slide when I first saw it. How you superimposed the London skyline beyond the Horse Guards skyline, just to show how close the buildings were in the city to breaching that skyline. The proposed Millennium Tower, shown in red here, was submitted for planning, but was withdrawn after your objection on behalf of the Royal Parks Agency. In its place came the Gherkin, which is below it, a much more sensitive proposal, thanks in no small part to your intervention. This slide shows the characteristics of the park that was identified as needing safeguarding, namely grass, trees, water, and sky in a natural composition. You recognised early the value of contact with nature as an antidote to the mental pressures of modern life in a big city. These photos of rural idyll are all in Hyde Park, surrounded by unseen metropolis. The method we used involved a lot of legwork back in those days, so we surveyed the angles of incidence of the view cones from key viewpoints out of the parks over the canopy of the trees that formed the skyline. Of course, we ended up with hundreds of view cones, as there are views in all directions, and the trees are all of different heights, requiring different measurements. We overlaid these view cones and joined the individual contour lines to result in a contour plan of the bottom of the sky space around the Royal Parks and across much of London. A tall building that breached these contour heights would be visible from the park, a very accessible tool, necessitating then a further impact assessment. The study and your subsequent advice to the Mayor as part of the Royal Parks response to the draft London plan was regrettably largely ignored. But the European Union did award you the Europa Nostra Medal for Cultural Heritage for the Sky Space report, which was richly deserved. Happily, the study led on to us being appointed by Edinburgh City Council to update their tall buildings policy around 2025. I thoroughly enjoyed our time walking the city together, debating the merits of a particular view and identifying with you the parameters needed to maintain its value. Surprisingly often, it was even in good weather, given it was in Edinburgh. We first identified 7 key features of the city that we thought defined the characteristics of Edinburgh: the castle, the Old Town Ridge, Carlton Hill and its monuments, Newtown, St Mary's Episcopal Church, Arthur's Seat and Salisbury Crags together, and the Firth of Forth. The inclusion of these last 2 features reflecting our landscape approach to this urban study. From that, we identified the documented 170 key views, all confirmed by public consultation, in which these 7 features were prominent and merited safeguarding. Each view had its own view sheet, as shown as an example on the right, which contained all the geometric information needed to calculate the height of the view cone at any given point within the defined view, thus enabling planners and developers the ability to carry out their own preliminary assessment to understand likely impact. Between field trips, we analysed the topography and plotted the views identified. With the view cones plotted, we defined the sky space that needed safeguarding and what that meant in a tangible heights above ordnance datum, following the same principles as the sky space report. The tangible heights were an important element. You wanted the study to be an easily accessible tool for the city planners and developers alike to use in order to effectively assess the potential impact of proposed tall building. Your policy recommendations were happily adopted by Edinburgh City Council in 2011. I have friends in Edinburgh who regularly mention that they have referred to it in their work, confirming the policy guidance is accessible and being used, which is very satisfying. Sadly, talk of a similar view study for Rio de Janeiro never materialised into field trips, at least not for the office. Thank you, Hal, for your support and mentorship over the years, and not to mention a career rewarding and interesting project. Thank you. Tim, Claire's going to finish.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. That brings us to the end of the working with Hal session, but before we hand back to Tim, I'd like to say, on behalf of all past and present members of the practice, many of whom are here today, I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank you, both of you actually, Hal and Chris, for your generous mentorship and support over the years. We recognise, we recognise that our way has been paved by 2 incredible people. Thank you.
Well, that's...
Could I just
yes, please.
I think one mustn't forget that actually the staff who work for Colvin and Moggridge do a lot of the work, and without them it wouldn't work out at all. The staff are really just as important as we are.
Well, I think we'd all agree to that. And thank you so much for setting the scene today in a really enjoyable way. And thank you to Jennifer. I think most of you who are landscape architects would agree that our careers are a search for the ideal client. And it sounds as if it was easier to find in London than in Benghazi.